Fake science, falling fertility, AnCap antics in Argentina, and more. The Monica Perez Show starts now. Hey, everybody. I am back in action. Had a little technical glitch there. Okay, let's just dive right in, shall we? One of the first stories, all the top stories today are just the same old things. They drive me crazy. The Trump trial, I'm not interested in that. I'm not even interested in who he picks for vice president. I don't really care who wins. Like, I am completely to the point where it's all so fake that it just seems to all blend together. It doesn't really matter who takes the lead. So, who's president? And the first thing I noticed, so I didn't like cover any of the things that were absolutely dominating the news, but there was one story that keeps popping up about Biden imposing additional tariffs on China. And I remember when Trump came out with this thing, I noticed a lot about his policies and the things that he said and did were not a reaction to this populist demand for, or Republican anyway, demand for a return of manufacturing to America. Like, that just wasn't something that I ever heard anybody talk about, or a lot of the other issues that he kind of latched onto. I feel like he had an agenda that was given to him, and he spoke these priorities into existence. And a big one was this idea of trade with China, trade deficits with China, and bringing back manufacturing here. And for me, it didn't even make sense because our basically because the labor unions drove wages so high and the circumstances for manufacturing here so untenable that it just wasn't practical. And I think they did it as part of a larger scheme to convert the United States into a service place. And I remember Bill Clinton actually saying this stuff about wanting America to be a service economy and having, or actually, the reality was 70% of the jobs would be service because that's where we would make more money. You would work less and make more if you did it that way. Whereas to have that kind of standard of living with manufacturing, the price of the finished products would be so high that not only could we not export it, we couldn't consume it. So it didn't make sense. And I have thoughts about why the labor unions do things like that. I think they do it to justify these larger moves or to justify automation. So, I think a lot of COVID was there to just say, oh, there's labor shortage. We don't mean to, but McDonald's has to convert people into iPads or whatever. So to see, and I tried to figure out like all the different reasons why Trump or the powers that be might want to convert us back to manufacturing or limit trade with China. A lot of possibilities come to mind. And one of them was that maybe we're headed towards war and that they need autarky, which is you need, like that was Mussolini's idea. You need to be able to manufacture stuff so that you can fight a war and deal with isolation and deal with not being able to trade overseas or whatnot. And I actually, as I distilled a lot of this material, I think there are a lot of possibilities, but I feel like I'm landing on that they're looking to establish trading blocks. I think they're looking to get back into a Cold War type footing for economic purposes. I've talked about this before. I've cited quotations that are kind of weird from economic leaders in Europe and Janet Yellen, and just saying like we need to adopt an economic bloc, a closed economic bloc in the West, similar to what the Soviet Union had. And I think this may be what it's all about. But let me tell you what he's up to and what the story is. Biden levies sweeping tariffs on China, intensifying trade fight with Trump. Okay, so here is the tell. When both sides are trying to outdo each other, they're racing in the same direction towards the same goal. That is a them policy, like a them trademark policy. That is not a bipartisan stalemate. Okay, it says, They're taking competitive protectionist approaches against Beijing. So, whatever. Beyond raising tariffs on electric vehicles by 100%, the White House said Tuesday, and then Trump immediately said, I'll do 200%. Good one. The White House said Tuesday that Biden was increasing a key tariff rate on steel and aluminum products to 25% from 7.5%, while the tariff on solar cells would rise to 50% from 25%. That's another policy change that I've noticed. Solar power, for some reason, they're backing off because why? That's exacerbating the decline in demand for solar power, which the Democrats say they want to encourage. Anyway, and a new duty on shipping cranes would be 25%. Those tariff increases, among others, will kick in this year, while others, including a tariff increase to 25% from 7.5% for larger storage batteries, and a new tariff on natural graphite set at 25% will take effect in 2026. Let's see. They're implementing these in stages to give people a chance to deal with the disruption in, whatever supplies, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So some of the other reasons, like you see Biden signing this with a bunch of labor representatives behind him, and the story is that he's responding to labor pressure. That may be true. It looks kind of like optics to me. I think this is a bigger picture thing. It is possible that one of the reasons is to lead to retaliation. That if China were then to impose tariffs against us, then that would be treason, but maybe we're giving, if Biden is in bed with China and China wants to be able to do that, wants an excuse in its own country. Sometimes these things are for the other country's propaganda purposes. But at the same time, as this came out today that I heard on Fox News, I read in Wall Street Journal an article about Robert Lighthizer, who was, I guess, he was in the Trump administration. I think, was he the actual trade guy? Anyway, whatever. He was the trade guy in Trump's administration, the first one. So here's what he says, and this adds to my interpretation of what Janet Yellen was saying. Well, actually, she said it openly about a month ago in Beijing, and I covered that, where the underlying goal that she was saying is you have to stop suppressing consumption. And her answer for them to stop suppressing consumption was actually to subsidize consumption. She didn't tell them to stop doing anything that they were doing. So our beef with them is that they're saving too much and consuming too little, which to me is such a tell as to how they treat us. They meaning that our government and its corporate sponsors exploiting American taxpayers and workers for the purpose of sucking all the surplus up to the top. So I noticed that this Christmas season, I was like, wow, a ton of spending gets, like, I save, I noticed that it's hard to cover the bills when Christmas spending comes along. I'm like, wow, like, I wonder if people just spend all their money on Christmas, like any money they might have saved at the end, they just piss away on stuff other people don't really need, or they would have it because we buy everything we need. So I noticed that was a big thing. There's always a push towards subsidizing consumption, whether it's infrastructure. So some big subsidies towards China are that we police the seas, we police the Pacific Ocean so that they don't have to worry about protecting their own goods. That alone would probably make it not efficient to ship frozen freaking shrimp at $4 a pound from China. That was my last straw. And you know what they do? What Smithfield does with the pork? China bought Smithfield. They grow the pigs here. They ship them over there to process, and then they ship them back to sell them to us. That is how think about all the transportation and logistics costs that are layered into that cheap meat. If that actually had to deal with the security of bringing it across the ocean or the roads, we're always talking about infrastructure. We pay the United States government, their policies and their taxpayer dollars subsidize rail transport, trucking, everything, fuel, wars for oil. It brings down the price of energy, and the energy is what moves this stuff around. So there's plenty of things we could do short of tariffs that would internalize externalities, which we have made external by our policies. So, uh, but my point is that all of those policies are about generating, subsidizing consumption by separating people from their money, because that's how they get the money, but that's also how they get taxes. And that's what they want China to do. And they're telling them to do it the way they do it to us. So this is Lighthizer saying something that really reminded me of what Yellen said. If you're running chronic surpluses for decades, then you are by definition a protectionist. You're engaging in industrial policy to help yourself. You're transferring resources from your consumers to your producers. You're trying to acquire other countries' assets. Like, it's wrong to produce more than you consume. That is de facto a protectionist policy to allow production to exceed consumption. Think about how disgustingly piggish that is. That the goal that it's considered immoral not to gobble up more than you produce. I mean, that's just messed up. So he says he doesn't think that China would retaliate, which is ridiculous to think that they wouldn't, and says it's possible a group of like-minded countries could eventually organize a better trading system. He also calls security alliances very good for America and very good for the world. NATO is essential. Alliances in Asia are very important. So that was one of the things that made me think that they were trying to pull together a block. So China has to consume more, or we will establish this block, which will close your production out from our market. And remember, when they brought down the walls in Eastern Europe, they gave those people money to spend. Like, the reason that was important to us was that we wanted those consumers. And I think that was true even for the Korean War, the Vietnam War. We wanted those consumers. And funny enough, also the production, the super cheap production, because the cheap production and maximum consumption, all that stuff in the middle, if the global corporations are the ones who dominate it, they get it all, especially if they have access to subsidized transportation, everything at scale, which maybe the little guys, it's not so easy. There was another study that I think Lighthizer might have been referring to that said that China's economy does discriminate against workers and consumers, with adversarial unions are illegal, so they have to cooperate with the producer. Taxes on labor and consumption are high, so taxes on consumption are high. And millions of migrant workers are deprived of social benefits for lack of residential permits. Yeah, so think about the twisted logic here. These Klein and Perez continue in their study to say, this was also in the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. financial system and consumer market function as a safety valve for exploitation elsewhere. Unless policies in the rest of the world change, the U.S. cannot unilaterally reduce inequality, raise living standards, and stabilize or reduce its current account deficit. Not that they don't try. Remember my example about the blueberry farmers in Oregon. My friend, who's an organic blueberry farmer, had to lease his land to potato chip makers. I need a quoodle that shows like a company growing potato chips, because he couldn't make the organic blueberries because they're so labor intensive to harvest blueberries without breaking them, that once Portland made the minimum wage $15 an hour, it put organic blueberries. So I bought organic blueberries from Chile or something for $4.99 a pint, which is actually pretty cheap. And I was like, oh, well, they can make them there and we don't have any restrictions, which is fine. I don't want the restrictions. I don't want someone who wants to give somebody a job not allowed to give the person who wants to take the job, because the government of Portland says that they can't, and to no end, to no purpose. So, I mean, to me, get rid of all those subsidies that subsidize infrastructure and transportation and energy. Also, get rid of policies that benefit labor unions. You don't have to get rid of labor unions. You don't have to ban them. You just have to not give them special treatment, not I know there's a thing called the right to work state, and I know Texas was one. I don't know exactly how that works. If that is about being hands off or is that anti-labor policy? I just don't know. But that's the general idea. You should have the right to not be in a union, even if a union has negotiated a contract with a company and some people are in the union. Um, that kind of stuff gets a little complicated, but my point is you can deal with all of these problems by eliminating subsidies and bad policy. Let's see if I had anything else from this. Okay. There were a couple of other big stories that I found interesting. Oh, one, it's kind of a one-off thing. It was in the journal, and I think it missed the point, but it totally brought out a an issue my listeners probably going to relate to. Flood of fake science forces multiple journal closures. Wiley to shutter 19 more journals, some tainted by fraud. So this company, which is an old company, it's like more than 200 years old, retracted over 11,000 articles in the past 2 years. And I don't like when independent, especially independent like media outlets fold. I remember I had a guy, Truth Dar Boy, who is a listener, and he used to email me. And he pointed out when Gawker went under, it's like it's not good to take out independent ones, no matter what. So these were sacrificial wolves, even like people who were bad and taken out. I don't like that because then you really have that highly centralized media control. And what the journal focused on for this company is this thing called paper mills, not paper mills, but paper mills. So apparently, this is how it works. There are either real studies, real articles, scientific articles where authors say, I've written this, I'm not publishing it under my own name. It's valid, but I would rather get $20,000 or $10,000 for somebody to pay me to say they are the author. So it was a Chinese company that was doing this. Apparently, a reporter for Science magazine went undercover, and a Chinese company said, "Oh, we got this article published in whatever magazine. It wasn't Nature. It was something more specific, like a trade rag kind of thing. We have this article. It's going to be published in this journal. If you give me $15,000, we'll put your name on it and say that you wrote it." And then I don't know if it's the flip side of the same transaction or if it's a different thing, but some of those journals are pay to play. So if they give the journal $5,000 to have the article placed and then they sell it to you for 15,000 to get your name on it, they're making $10,000 each thing. But for me, that's not the worst thing if the science is good. But apparently, a lot of the articles were written. Well, they're saying that some of the articles, this is what they were focused on, were written by AI, that it's gibberish, it's gobbledygook. Now they're using AI to ferret that stuff out. But generative AI is so much better at it that could be worse and harder. But for me, it's not so much this fraud and all of that. It's the fact that I was just watching this documentary called Mirage Men about how the government promoted some of the UFO mythology to cover up their own tech, and how they did it, how they had people planted and communicating with UFO researchers, with smart people, with tech guys, and really messing around with them, getting in there and broadcasting stuff onto their radios and everything. So they're willing to go to great ends to put disinformation out. So what if there's a CIA front that's a paper mill that's putting stuff out there that it can later hide behind? Oh, well, this was an obvious fraud. This was an AI thing. These papers are a dime a dozen. They're not meant to change scientific discourse. They're just there to make money. But if in reality they are specifically planted to change scientific discourse, to put scientific disinfo out there without ever being traced back to the people who did it, then uh that kind of stuff, it gets searched, it gets picked up on, it gets built upon. I mean, there have been many studies or you've heard it, I'm sure, where it's like the game of operator. Like once it gets embedded in the lexicon, the book Inventing the AIDS Virus. Carrie Mullis and the author Duesberg said the whole AIDS thing was based on a study that was not verified. And if you tried to get people to go back to that first building block, they would yell at you. They would be mean to you. Those guys were marginalized because of it. So that's what I think is the real danger here. But the Wall Street Journal didn't even touch on that possibility that bad science might be put there by Big Pharma or something. It doesn't even talk about that. Okay. Another article in the journal today. Suddenly, there aren't enough babies, and the whole world is alarmed. Birth rates are falling fast across countries with economic, social, and geopolitical consequences. All right, this will drive you crazy because we all see that they've been trying to, capital T, trademark, they have been trying to suppress population growth for decades, 70 years, probably 60 years at minimum. I mean, China had the one child policy. It's very clear that it was going to result in a demographic bust. They still didn't even reverse it until recently. And you see how birth control has been pushed. Abortion, I think, has killed over 60 million babies since Roe versus Wade. That in itself would, if really all those babies would get born, which I never thought so. I thought for people who have many abortions, maybe having one kid would have stopped them from having future pregnancies. But if those babies were born, I mean, because they talk about how do you replace that, and they're saying like fertility rates declining, or people making the decision to not have children, or the immigration disruption during COVID. Like that was the biggest population impact over time of COVID, and the vaccine doubtful. But they're talking about all these things that contribute, and what they focus on in this article is that people are deciding not to have babies, and that's definitely a part of it. And I would say the absolute greatest contributor to that is propaganda, first of all. I would say, so, don't have kids, population explosion. The biggest propaganda thing there is to get women to delay childbearing by higher education, going into the workforce. I'm not judging. I did it myself, but I absolutely did it because I was persuaded by, this constant barrage of that kind of, the propaganda to do that. And also because people aren't getting, the social contagion is a big part. So nobody was getting married and having kids when they were 20, when I was 20. So, I mean, it wasn't an option for you to get married and have kids, was my experience. They also, all that like women's health, reproductive health, public health that they push into third world countries so hard absolutely has an effect. I mean, it's a big, big deal. And they're even complaining about how, wow, these countries where you'd think they would keep having babies, for some reason, they're all having, taking birth control. All of a sudden, it's like, well, obviously. And then they're also saying that propaganda, which they're not calling propaganda, they're calling it like FOMO, fear of missing out, with poor women who have the internet and are seeing these glamorous images of Western women in business suits and stuff. They don't want to have kids. There's a lot. They're trying to identify a lot of the reasons. For me, when I observed how few European women I knew, just in you have a lot of international exposure when you go to these big East Coast colleges, maybe everywhere now. And also, I worked in a big bank. I worked at Citibank, and I just knew Europeans, and the women's attitudes, like it was almost frowned upon to want to be a mother. I really didn't know anybody who pursued that or wanted that. What they wanted was to go to graduate school till they were in their 30s, which didn't cost anything, and then be respected for their minds. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it was very clearly a cultural thing. And I attributed it to, on the one hand, them having that subsidized, like, education for life thing. And on the other hand, it being so expensive to live, the tax rate, socialism, has a big impact, whether it's like taxes, out of your income or just the fact that everything's so expensive. There's no surplus left at the end of the day, which is what Lighthizer was saying about, China. I can't believe you want surplus. Like, that's awful. So I always felt that it was just too expensive. It wasn't tenable. And what man, like in Europe, is going to take on the responsibility of having a wife and child when he could have a woman who just goes and works too? Or you know what I mean? It just seemed very like that. If people observe the same thing themselves. But what they don't talk about here is how much of the decline in birth rates to like the non-replacement rate, which is definitely where we're headed, is due to choice and how much of it is due to fertility declines. Because I don't recall the article saying anything about fertility problems. So I just took the initiative to search IVF. Like, is IVF booming? Yes, it is. Is infertility on the rise? Yes, it is. Now, it's hard to get up to the minute data, which is kind of interesting because what I wanted to see is if fertility in women has plummeted in 2023 because the vax rolled out in 2021 and there was a little baby boom, teeny little baby boom, but then the baby bust continued. I know it said that there were 3.6 million babies born last year, which I think was 2023. And then it took forever for me to find that there were 2.9 million deaths in 2023. So it looks like births outpaced deaths by 1.7 million in the US last year, which actually didn't sound that bad. So, and the birth rate is clearly 1% of the population. You can just eyeball it and see that. It says, okay. Oh, here was a little tidbit. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington now thinks population will peak at around 9.5 billion in 2061, then start declining. I remember seeing that it was going to peak at 11 billion way sooner than that. They have really changed their outlook for that, which I would say, whatever. I'm not sure that they're genuine in getting those numbers wrong when they were still pushing the population bust scenario. But I also remember at the time not being too worried about it because as long as you keep arable land online, which I know they're trying to get it offline and make it all wild again, but if you kept all the arable land online, current tech would have allowed 14 billion people to live on what the earth could produce. So there's no Malthusian future at this point, but what they're having us focus on is that there's a terrible, terrible labor shortage. And I think the reason they wanted this outcome and the labor shortage is because the ratio of retired people to workers is skyrocketing. So there's way more retired people compared to workers. And I would say part of that is you could just raise the retirement age. And I don't mean like there needs to be an official retirement age, just keep working, keep working. It's good for you. Keep working. But they won't arrange it that way. They want immigration to be like the answer to that. But I would also say that it gives the powers that be this excuse to automate. They would like the demographic bust, of course, because we're easier to control that way. And if they have an excuse like this to automate, that too makes it easier for us to be controlled. And it also gives them an excuse to lower our standard of living, which seems to me to be a policy goal. So when I say, oh, who's them? I'm just saying the government seems to have policy goals. We can get into that at other times, but I highly recommend Servando Gonzalez's Psychological and the New World Order, Psychological Operations, maybe? People maybe can remember that one for me. Do I have 1 minute to just read some of the dumb stuff this guy said? This annoyed me. I'll tell you something. This annoyed me. Okay. This guy said he was one of the researchers trying to figure out the causes for people not having kids. He said, Kearney said, while raising children is no more expensive than before. No. Sorry, wrong quote. Okay. They said state level differences in parental abortion notification laws, unemployment, Medicaid availability, housing costs, contraceptive usage, religiosity, childcare costs, and student debt explained almost none of the decline. We are seeing a broad societal change that's hard to measure or quantify. So they're saying none of those policy uh, factors could explain the differences from state to state in the decline in having children. But I think that taxation has a big part of it. Maybe social attitudes. So I will give him that. Uh, he also said that people spent more time with their children than in the past. So raising children takes longer and is harder. And actually, I've thought of that before. I was like, my mother had 9 kids. I could barely handle 3. And why is that? And I was not great at it. Like I wasn't going to all the soccer games. I didn't have my kids playing the piano by the time they were 6. Like I didn't do any of that stuff. I just didn't take it seriously. And I reflected on it. I thought, wow, what people are doing now is making these super high functioning supercomputer kids. You're putting a lot into them. You can have fewer. And the reason I notice it is how absolutely not overprotective, just highly protective people are of their kids, which is why I was so surprised that in the rich suburbs of California, people adopted the vax so easily to their children. That was nuts to me. But that because they're putting so much time, effort, and money into these fewer kids, they're desperate for them to be not only survive, but to be successful. So for me, I'm not sure whether it's they have fewer kids because of all of that, or they have all of that, and so that they're over investing in the kids they have because they don't have as many, or if they don't have as many because the investment is so great. I'm not sure which is causal or if it's correlated at all. But there are a lot of reasons. But they put us in this position. It was absolutely foreseeable, no question about that. And COVID made this situation potentially worse. We will have to see how it affects fertility. And you just got to wonder why, you know? All right, let's get to some comments. Hey, y'all. It is the bottom of the hour. All right. Hi, Stuart. Hi, Jack. Jack says, I should know this being a Texan. We are a right to work state. And I think it means that you can quit or be fired anytime, no reason necessary. But I'm self-employed, so I don't really know. That's great. I mean, if you can quit or be fired at any time, that makes for a really fluid job market. Same thing with housing. If you don't have rent control, if you don't have leases, I mean, I like having a lease, but if you didn't, the more and like they say, border, like in a natural environment where you don't have border control, you just have people coming in or leaving based on the jobs, they leave again. When you have porosity there, you have a healthier market, you have more job opportunities, more, housing openings, more flexibility in how many immigrants you have, and they'll go back to their home country. So these barriers to movement can have terrible consequences that are never given lip service. Frightening Me says the CIA definitely prints a lot of studies, of course. Cat Duckness, isn't using AI to find AI a little sketchy anyway? Yeah, I kind of feel like we should just sit back. It's like a wiener dog fight. Is Johnny here? It's like, I don't. I'm just going to watch. Yes, it's like the FBI investigating itself, right? No wrongdoing there. Frightening Me says feminism was a psyop. Absolutely, because look, who is raising your kids? Like, as I think about this, feminism is to call it feminist to separate parents from their children, and it affects everybody. It affects the dad too. The dad's connection with their children. If the I like my dynamic because I don't work outside the house where for stuff at home, I'm the go-to person, and my husband is kind of better at like, how do you apply for college or whatever. But we work together as a team, and it makes us all closer. This idea that women were saddled with parenting, and then as you get older, you know, you see the generations change, your parents die, and you think, what what is important? And I've mentioned this before. I had a friend who was dying, I had a friend who was going to jail, and another friend who was dying. And they all said the same thing. The only thing they care about is relationships. And what's your most important relationship? Those bonds of parent and child. It's the more time you can spend with them, the better. The fact that you set yourself up to not be able to do that is definitely not an organic idea. Maverick Pilgrim. The idea of Europeans not wanting to have kids till their 30s is maybe a thing in the cities, but in the more rural areas, it is different. This was and is huge in Australia and New Zealand. Saw it a lot in early 2000s New Zealand. Yes, I was thinking about that. That even in like rural England, people will have a lot of kids. It's very urban. And one of the things about the demographic bust that these articles have been talking about is how and I mentioned this probably last week, they're closing schools, they're closing hospitals. And what happens is if you have places that kind of overbuilt, over accommodated institutionally, and then you shrink those places, close them down, people have to move, have to centralize themselves, and then you have an urbanization. There's more to, I think, over subsidizing something than pulling back than I've ever thought of as being intentional, but I do think it is. PSYOPs have always been about changing the culture, Jack says. Maverick says lots of older parents, no more than 2 kids in a family, unless it was a farming rural town. He continues about Australia and New Zealand. Then parents in their early 20s, 4 to 5 kids in a family. So there's a rural urban divide. Yep. Destruction of the greater family unit drives young people into cities for universities and professional work, less influence authority of older generations, less pooling of family resources. That's true. And you know what else does that? Drafts for war, or if you have a labor surplus and the young men go to the service. Also, sending your kids away to college pulls them out of your home. There's big pushes to get literally, I think it was like the article was like getting rural Trump supporters into universities. So they changed their politics. Like it was probably the New York Times, but yeah, they pulling them into the cities and or pushing the cities to them through the internet and propaganda and stuff. Like they said in that article, that third world countries are getting propagandized by the internet to make them want to mimic city gals. Over socialized, over propagandized, undereducated, under influenced to actual wisdom. Yeah, that's absolutely true. The novel's fine. Maverick apologized for the novel. It was good. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had an arc. Whipped cream from a cow. Urban cities suck to plan your life in. Yes, I realized that. I used to love Manhattan. I was young. I was looking for, the vibrance of it, the external stimulation of it. But when it came to raising kids, I was like, how could you ever even consider that? Yeah, how could you even want that? But I always did think that retiring into a really big city, especially New York, would be great because most of your steps, most of your miles driven are in an elevator where you're really not responsible. I mean, I've never lived in a place in New York that wasn't just a couple of steps away from a Korean grocery and an Irish bar. I think that's all you need. And, entertainment and stuff. All right, let's get to a little more news stories. Okay, we did China. Actually, let's get to the story that's going to lead to the clip. Okay, so the story is Argentina's president pledged fiscal shock therapy. So far, he's delivering economic pain. This was from the Wall Street Journal, I think, yesterday. Poverty, hunger, and food prices are rising, but Javier Milei, like melee, says the quote promise of prosperity is at hand if his overhaul can take hold. So I remember when Trump was elected, November 2016, and I asked Dean, my tweep, what he thought this was all about because it was a shock to everybody. And he said, well, they'll get a conservative in there and then they can blame economic problems or economic pain on conservative policies. Now, Trump is not conservative. I think we saw that. And the whole lot of other agenda items was unfolded with Trump, and maybe it's true with this guy, but I never really paid much attention to this guy. People like, oh, this libertarian AnCap elected. I'm like, you know what? There's absolutely no way a genuine same thing with I can't take Bolsonaro seriously or Boris Johnson, any of these like disruptors with crazy hair. I just cannot take them seriously because they look like created persons to me. And if you scratch the surface, I think you will find that. Plus, this guy, uh, he does act ridiculous, and it seems to discredit the seriousness of a libertarian economic position anyway. And my father used to say, like, he would just hate to see socialism and the welfare state and stuff gaining traction and snowballing because he would say it's so easy. It's so easy to give this to people. You're giving them something. It's so easy for politicians to sell it and for people to buy it. And before the consequences are felt, it feels good. He said, but when you have to pull back, when the pain starts, you're going to have to do it slowly and painfully. So this guy's coming into Argentina, had 25% inflation, and what he did was he cut a lot at once. And yes, inflation has come down, but is that the right way to do it? I mean, this is a very complicated thing for me to hash out right here, but again, like the first thing I would do if I were going to try to make a place less socialist is I would take down barriers to entry in business. So a lot of times if a government business, like a telecommunications company, it will have barriers to entry. You cannot compete with the government, with the utilities, with the telecommunications. You can't compete. So start with just allowing the competition. Or if you want to make that stuff private, like one of the things he's planning to do is to privatize industry. I would say the way to do it is to have a very, very open auction, open to everyone. And as long as somebody is qualified, make the evaluation process open, get that, sell the thing, and I guess pay down debt with it. Or if you have to keep spending money, do that. But a lot of times the quote privatization process, I would say maybe every single time, is placed in the hands of someone for political reasons. It enriches that person. It hands them a monopoly. So however they're going to do it, I'm usually pretty skeptical about that. But let's hear about what he actually did. He halved the number of ministries and eliminated 70,000 public sector jobs. Like, that's a pretty abrupt insertion of unemployment. He suspended new public works contracts and removed various subsidies. So another thing you can do with public works and stuff, you can just let them work off. You don't have to like cut it all off at once. You can just let stuff work off, not hire any new people. If you didn't hire any new people in the public sector, eventually there would just, that would go away. But this seemed to be an urgent situation. It seemed like he wanted to get their spending under control. But really, what I just saw today was after he did all this, guess what? It made the IMF, who had already given Argentina $44 billion, happy enough to give him another $1 billion or something, 800 million, 400 million, something like that. So he's doing what the IMF wants. Normally, the IMF comes in and imposes austerity on these socialist countries and wherever or take some of their assets. The IMF does cause pain, and they pretty much always do. And they're doing it through an anarcho-capitalist, supposedly, now. And nobody's talking about how the IMF generally pushes these very policies. They just have to do it slower because they're not trying to discredit the government that's complying with them. So he cut primary government spending by 40% in the first quarter of 2024, slashing financial transfers to provinces, so federal to state, basically, stopping public works, and holding salaries and pensions at steady levels instead of raising them with inflation. Inflation is 25% a year. So if you don't have a cost of living increase, it's going to nothing pretty quickly. He wants the Senate to approve a bill with 230 different articles that would privatize some state companies, loosen stiff labor regulations, which, I would say I would generally be in favor of, increase government revenue by restoring the income tax that was eliminated last year. I myself am not a fan of income tax. I feel like property tax makes more sense because it's the property owner who is demanding public services, public protection. It is not the worker who's really demanding much of anything. You can have a poll tax, like if you're right to, every single human being pays $1,000 to vote. I think that's considered racist. I mean, you could make a floor for the impoverished, I guess. Anyway, any economic recovery. Oh, yeah. And I also feel like it makes sense sometimes to have a property ownership as a criterion for taxes. I can understand the pros and cons of that. But if you had it where they were the only ones paying the taxes, I guess that would be a captive government. But we have a captive government. They talk a lot about lifting currency controls. And I feel like when they start talking about that stuff, it gets hard for you to apply like political ideology because it gets kind of economics-y. But what that usually does is allow for a lot of foreign direct investment. So they're probably keeping foreigners from going in there and buying up assets for a song. And I have a friend in Argentina who told me that I think she paid her dog walker for an hour's work like less than $1. She just moved back there just to live off her, like one paycheck for a year. She's like, it's ridiculous. It's funny money. Like you really shouldn't, this would be a terrible time, I think, if you cared about your country to allow foreign direct investment. And that's what I think this story really shows the most is that in this country, people are getting to be like post-libertarian. They're saying, okay, close the borders, don't allow global corporations, don't allow China to buy property. Like that's what's happening now. But here they're saying, oh, we should have super, super free trade, but it's a terrible time to do that if you care about your country. And they're going to blame it on libertarian principles. And then they can do away with libertarian principles after foreign global companies have probably bought up everything in Argentina. So I call it like right versus right. Yes. Oh, okay. So here, let's get to our closing clip. My producer, Bobby, thank you, hats up to Bobby, sent me this article by coincidence. So I don't know why this melee, I'm going to call him melee, has been like bubbling up in every different direction that I've looked in the past day or two. But he sent me this article. And in the article, it's like this guy has promised to counter the elites, to be for the people, like all the corruption, blah, blah, blah. If he gets every single asset, including the infrastructure, the government institutions bought up by global corporations in one fell swoop, he will not have been countering elitism and the establishment at all. This article is crazy. I'll have to put it in the show notes. But in that article, it shows this. I guess I'm just going to have to let it speak for itself. This, my brothers and sisters, is the face of international anarcho-capitalism. This is the president of Argentina, who is an example to the world of what our policies, the face of our policies. Okay, guys, that's it. I'll see you on Thursday at 2:00 Pacific, 5:00 Eastern. This is Monica Perez.
Gastar y gastar y gastar y gastar, esa es nuestra regla fiscal. Y si los ingresos no aguantarán más, ahí iremos al Banco Central. Y eso será inflacionario, y eso será inflacionario. Si no le aflojan al gasto, entonces la crisis vendrá. ¡Viva la libertad, carajo!
Un aplauso grande para Javier, el general AnCap.